Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rule Y'all and to another author talk. I, of course, am your host, Dr. Chea Parton, and I am so excited for y'all to join us as I talk with the author and poet of the collection Gay Poems for Red States, Willie Edward Taylor Carver Jr. If you checked out the episode before this one, you know a little bit more about the collection. If you haven't watched that, I suggest that you do that. And Willie is an amazing person. He is a huge advocate for queer youth and rural youth. He was, Teacher of the Year in Kentucky in 2022. So he is an amazing human being, and I am so excited for you to join our conversation today. I was trying to figure out how I wanted to introduce this episode, and I thought, what better way than to read just one more of Willie's poems. This one's called Creek. Our trailer perched itself, proud and ancestral, in a sunny and grass-eaten valley bottom. On its muddy britches haunches, it stared at the creek that flattened it out of the holler. It was a trailer that rolled its cigarettes with the smell of window air conditioner and hog bacon, mouth deep, dirt grit, and graveled with hard work. Hog bacon was the kind we killed ourselves. I killed myself to leave the holler and bought pink store pork and smile-scented supermarkets, but everyone looked at me and could see the dried mud clinging hard to the bottom of my shoes. It asked me if I knew about Jesus. They couldn't help but stare or look around or through me, since everyone knows that mud doesn't talk, and if it ever did, it wouldn't talk about Jesus. Before such non-believers, I became the valley bottom, and my holler and the creek swelled within me, bursting over the banks and spewing out mud and muck and the mundane and marvelous. And garbage. It floated out of me until water, once brown and muddy, ran clean and pure and declared unto me before God and man and animal, "You are the eighth day. You are a creek." I am always 3 years old. Clouds are singing with tambourines. I'm flat in the mud, hissing hose still robbing from the well, stirring up pine straw, gravel, sunlight, and grass. The water is cool and mossy tin, but the mud, the earth are love you warm, and they both whisper opening flower secrets through the thick sheets of trees. I squish my toes in the mud, put my cheek against the strong and loving chest of the ground. No before, no after, just clouds and blue and brown and now and warm and being where I am. I wrap my arms around the earth and squeeze the weeds, an embrace that makes the mountains squall in tongues. I am creek. I am dangerous. I flood. I keep on going, probably till the ocean, and I start at the head of a holler. So I just wanted to share that poem with you because I think it exemplifies everything that Reading Rule Y'all appreciates about rural YA literature and rural literature in general, the way that it pays attention to place and geography and people and their interactions with each other and with the non-human things in the world. And so I just felt like that poem really exemplifies a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this interview, but also just a lot of what I care about as a reader and what I think is important for young readers to get to experience, especially when they live and are from and claim rural places. So I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did, and get excited and stay tuned because here comes the rest of the episode. Hello, and welcome back to Reading Rural Y'all, where we talk about all things rural YA literature and to the writers who write it. I am your host, Dr. Chea Parton, and today we are talking to another amazing writer, a poet, Willie Edward Taylor Carver Jr. I absolutely cannot tell you how much I loved his recent collection, Gay Poems for Red States. I have goosebumps right now just thinking about it. Willie is an advisor, an educator, a public speaker, an author, and somebody who wants to and works to make the world better. He is the 2022 Kentucky Teacher of the Year winner and the author of Gay Poems for Red States, which I just talked about. He also serves as a board member of the Kentucky Youth Law Project, which helps LGBTQ youth in Kentucky with legal needs. On the editorial advisory board of the Appalachian Futures series of the University Press of Kentucky, and is a recurring co-host and contributing board member of Progress Kentucky. He's amazing, and he's here. Thanks so much for making time to chat with me, Willie. I am super excited that you're here because you're the first poet that we've had on the show. And so I'm just really tickled to be able to talk with you and to have this conversation.
Listen, the tickling is all mine. And thank you so much for that kind introduction. It always sounds so much more dramatic than it feels that I'm on 100 boards, because usually a board just means we go to a coffee shop and discuss things. But I'm so happy to be here and delighted.
So we're going to start out with the first question that I ask everybody because it's my obsession and I think it's important and not enough people think about it. So could you talk a little bit about your background, where you're from, and how you feel like that's impacted who you are as both a person and a writer?
Sure. So I'm from Floyd County, Kentucky. My husband is from Georgia, and he always says that the first few months he thought maybe I was some sort of spy because every answer I gave was different. Depends on like how I always assess whether that person can actually take the answer. So near Pikeville could be an answer, near Lexington if you're far enough away. Floyd County is one answer I might give. Kentuckians identify by county.
Yep.
Martin, Kentucky, if you're from Eastern Kentucky, and then I will say Frogtown Holler if you're from a tri-county area. So Frogtown Holler. And you know, I don't I don't think I even thought about what Appalachia was or meant a lot when I was a kid, other than this sort of pervading feeling, because it's what everybody told me, that we were somehow at the bottom of the entire earth, and that everyone was looking down on me. Like I was reminded constantly, but I was reminded in like a semi-empowering way, like don't let them think they're better than you just because of where you're from. So I was always sort of reminded, oh, well, everyone must think they're better than me, even though I've been told not to let them think that. But it creeps in that sort of defensiveness. And then I think life taught me that a lot of the warnings were correct. A lot of people do think that they're better. If they don't know, they think it, because they've never been called to question their bias. But I grew up with good, hardworking people. I think I believe in people because of where I'm from. We had good years financially, and we had horrific years. I never had a bad Christmas. I never went to school without adequate clothing, because as long as there were women in Appalachia, I knew I'd have something to wear, and I knew that I would be taken care of. So no matter how ugly things get politically, there's a part of me that believes in people. And I know that we're overcoming ignorance, prejudice, lots of fake information, but I know that people are good. And I have an unshakable faith in humanity. I also think coming from Appalachia makes comedy better. When I lived in New England, love their hearts, people would love to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Literally, they would apologize to me when I say that I come from Eastern Kentucky or Appalachia. And they would say they would want to talk about what it feels like now. And I would always say, like, especially once I kind of got annoyed with people, like, I really miss how smart people were. And I don't mean to say that New Englanders aren't smart, but the way conversation works in Appalachia is quite different from other places. The goal is to keep people on their toes. So you tell a story and you make it stretch out forever and ever to see if they're following along. You might even give false leads, false promises. When you are talking to people, I don't know. A lot of it is just, I'm going to pepper some lies in here, and I expect that you're able to know the difference. And it's not about trying to confuse people. It's really just about a game of language. Language is so richly used in Appalachia. So I think those are the best and worst that I probably carry.
So I identify so much with everything that you're talking about. My growing up, my papa used to tell me all the time, he had nicknames for all of us kids, and mine was Punky, but usually got shortened down to Punk. And he'd say, "Punk, them people ain't any different than you. They get up the same way you do and put their pants on the same way every morning, one leg at a time." And so anytime I've ever gone to like anything that I've been nervous about, an academic conference, especially because being like rural working class
Mhm.
of like Appalachian heritage in academia is like a little uncomfortable a
Mhm.
lot of the time. And so anytime I ever, was getting up to make a presentation or whatever, I would just always think to myself, like, they got up the same way you did. They put their pants on the same way you do every morning, and they are not any better than you. And the flip side of that too is you are not any better than them.
Mhm.
Um,
You know who does
so
a really good job with this? Chris Offutt in Kentucky Straight.
mm,
So my husband, he's from near Atlanta, and when he came, like he had lots of cultural issues when he. I actually have more cultural issues moving to Georgia than I did moving to France. There's a lot of
mm,
parallels between France and Appalachia. Sort of like the minimizing yourself for
sure.
other people's sake. You don't
Mm,
do that in most of America. And he didn't understand when my friends were trying to be friendly with him. I think sometimes he thought they were making fun of him. So it took him a
mm,
while. Matter of fact, the first day he was dressed in like a basic nice button-up shirt, but he legitimately made me stop at Goodwill and switched into like old kind of ratty clothes because they were riding him and be like, "Oh, Mr. Fancy Shirt." Um, but anyway, Chris Offutt. In one of the short stories in Kentucky Straight, some guys are hauling a trailer up a holler, and it falls on somebody. And he's clearly in the process of dying. And the narrator thinks out loud that they ought to apply a tourniquet, but he doesn't want to sound uppity because there's older men taking care of it. So he doesn't tell them what they need to do. And the guy, he might die, he might not, I don't remember. But my husband was like, "Is this real? Would someone?" And I was like, honestly, I could see if you were young and especially if you'd gone to like college, you'd
mm,
probably just keep your mouth shut.
yeah, yeah.
And anyway, but yeah, you're right. There's a humility. And I think often Appalachians misunderstand the intentions of non-Appalachians because we're not used to anybody not having that humility. And so when we see them sort of approach us and speaking without it, we interpret it as we would back home, right? And it took me a long time to get over that. And I mean, so I'm a French major, so I left Eastern Kentucky and then lived in France, and could handle all of France pretty well. But the weird thing is, like, I still think somewhere internally I have issues like with Cincinnati, because when I was growing up, like that's the place that judges you and thinks it's better than you.
Right.
So I every single time I have done a speaking engagement in Cincinnati, I have been drenched in sweat.
Mm,
Manhattan, no.
yeah.
Paris, no. Cincinnati,
um, yeah, I think there's so much cultural alignment. The teasing and ribbing, is how you're
mm,
loved. If somebody doesn't tease you, you just really need to work on your relationship with that person.
yes.
Um, I love your point about like sprinkling in like we used to call them because of our love of David Letterman, we used to call them writer's embellishments. Um, and so like, but they happen in every single story. And like the play in the play with words, it always floors me that people think that rural people or like rural language varieties, including Appalachian varieties, like are somehow lesser than, because
Hmm.
all of the rural people and Appalachian people I know um use the best similes,
Hmm.
the best metaphors, like and like wordplay is
Hmm.
so huge. Um we like one of our favorite games is to use words that are like adjacent but not exact. So like geology instead of geography. Like if somebody
Hmm.
mentions a country or something, my dad will be like, "Well, I wouldn't know because I've never really been very good at geology."
Hmm.
And we know
Yes.
that he knows
Hmm.
he's using the wrong word. He's doing it on purpose to be
Hmm.
funny.
Yeah. And part of
Um,
the humor is seeing if the other person can catch what you're doing, right? And
yeah,
if they don't, that's fine. It's not like you're gonna like shame them. But I
right,
think
no.
if you don't know the system, you don't get it.
Right.
I had a lot of people in Vermont who would I would say something and they would go, "Oh, that's such a lovely little Southern expression. What does it mean?" And I would say, "That's not an expression. That's me using language creatively. No one says that. I just invented it." So
Right.
you're absolutely right. So I teach French, and one of the things I love the most is when there's a parallel between Appalachian and French that doesn't exist in standard English.
Mm,
So only those kids who speak an Appalachian variant, and I lived in the Gateway region between Appalachia and the Bluegrass area. We literally
okay.
call it the Gateway region.
Mhm,
So a good example is pas deux. So English doesn't use articles in certain situations.
mhm,
So if you mean the idea of something like pizza is good, you don't say the,
right.
or if you don't have one, like I ain't got pizza. So
Right.
in French, you have to determine which case it is. And in one, you use pas deux, and the other, you use le or la. But it mirrors Appalachian perfectly. So you would say, I ain't got pizza, which means something different from I ain't got no pizza. Um,
Right.
and so I would just say to the students, whenever you would say, I ain't got no pizza, use pas deux, and it works perfectly. And then a good third of them will go, oh, and then the other kids will be like, what? So there's a rule, there's grammar that's inherent in the way Appalachian people and any version of English speak. But there's this belief that somehow it's incorrect when often it's just more complex.
Yeah, it's actually more sophisticated
Hmm.
than, what I like to call middle class mainstream English.
Hmm.
And because I think there are definitely class connections and stuff there too
For
that
sure.
doesn't get thought about a lot. But yeah, that's a really, really great example. Um, I would talk sometimes in my PhD about how like the language variety that I learned growing up is not, even though I'm white,
Hmm.
is not what people like to call standard academic English. That's not,
Hmm.
I learned very quickly that the way that I talked meant that people weren't going to listen to me unless I changed. And so then I
Hmm.
worked to like come to understand standard academic English and be able to use it real good, you know? Um, but they would always ask me like, well, what's an example of something that's different in your language variety than, what's in standard academic English? And I'm like, man, you can't just put me on the spot.
Hmm.
Like, like I can't think of anything right now, but if we get into the context of a conversation, I might be able to say, oh, this is how we would use this. Or one of my favorites is to correct people who think that bless your heart only means something bad.
Hmm.
And it's like,
Yeah.
no, it just depends on how you say it, to whom you say it, and
Hmm.
what the situation is. If you're
Yeah.
being an idiot and I say, well, just bless your little pea picking heart,
Hmm.
then yes, you're being a moron, But like if something bad has happened to you and I
Hmm.
say, "Oh, bless your heart," then that is like, sincere. Like I'm not
Yeah.
saying you're an idiot because something bad happened to you. I'm saying like legitimately, I'm so
Hmm.
sorry.
Yeah.
Um or if I'm an elderly lady and a younger like whippersnapper has held the door open for me and I walk through and I like, touch their cheek and I'm like, "Bless your heart." That's like a
Hmm.
thank you.
Hmm.
Like thank you for contributing to society. Like it can mean so many different things depending on like how it's said and in
Yeah.
what context.
I had a colleague in Rutland High School in Vermont. She said, "Good morning. How are you?" And I said, "I'm good. How are you?" And she goes, "Don't you mean well?"
Ugh.
And I said, "Well, that depends. Are we using it as a substantive qualifier or as a qualifying adverb?" And she kind of looked at me and I said, "No, I would like for you to speak since you're trying to teach me grammar. Which are you trying to elicit?" And then she just sort of did this, and I said, "I thought so." So don't think for a second I don't know these rules better than you, and I don't care.
Right. I know what I said, but you clearly don't.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah. The correction thing really bothers me.
Mhm.
And especially in academic spaces, like there have been several times where I've turned in an article that has some phrase or something that I know is gonna get picked out. Even the use
Mhm.
of folks, like somebody was like, "Shouldn't we say people?" And I'm like, "No, because
Why?
that's not what I would say.
Yeah.
I
And
would
what
say
exactly is
folks."
wrong with folks?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a major issue with that sort of thing, and who doesn't get corrected.
Yeah.
So if you, I focus a lot on how the ACT does English, and I
Mhm.
love to point to students just how flawed it is, and it's skewed in favor of speakers of sort of rich white English.
Yep.
So a good example is if you look at usage checks, they only check common errors, which necessarily means poor and working class. The errors that are made by sort of the upper crust can't necessarily can't be common, which means they're not assessed.
Mm.
So, and by errors, I don't really believe in errors, but
Right.
what we
Same.
call standard English. So officially in English, right, you have subject pronouns I and you have the object pronoun me.
Me.
So you can say he and I went to the store, give the paper to him and me. No, most rural white people will say me and him went to the store. So they
Yeah.
check for that to see if you make the mistake.
Right.
But a lot of rich white people will say you could give the paper to Bobby or I,
Right.
right? They do
Yes.
not check for that at all,
Right.
even
That's
though
good.
it's a mistake.
Wow.
So what they're really doing is a filter to see who's poor or rural.
Yeah. Yeah. This is also great.
And this is one example. I actually have a list somewhere of all the things that they look for on the ACT. Most of it's like verb form. Like who cares? What in the world does
Right.
whether you say done or did have to do
Right.
with the intelligent you are or your
Or like I
capacity on
seen,
paper?
yeah,
Yeah.
we seen that movie the other day, or
Hmm.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you find that, will you send it to me?
Yeah.
Because a lot of my work has to do with like rural language varieties and sort of like legitimizing them as a
Mhm.
variety of English and not just like wrong English.
Mhm.
Um, and I've done one of my blog posts is like a what's the word I'm looking for? Like an inventory
Mhm.
of my own rural Appalachian
Mm.
infused Hoosier, speech. And so I think it would be really interesting to like cross check the things that I'm used to doing and the things that like come most naturally to me to do
Mhm.
and what the ACT looks for.
Yeah.
So I would
I'll
love
see
to
if I
have
can
that.
find it. I've also
If
got a
not, no
sample.
worries, but
I've also got a sample essay somewhere where I'm showing most of my writing in the last 20 years has been samples for students, but I wrote an essay about the issues with the ACT, and I think I referenced some stuff on there too, but I'll find it.
yeah, I would love to see that. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about our rural connections, our rural experiences, rural language, and all of those things. And we talked even before we hopped on here and started recording about the fact that we've actually
Mhm.
met before and didn't even realize it through a talk that I gave at Morehead State. And so one of the things that I am curious about, because part of my mission is to get like rural literature as like a recognized
Mhm.
publishing, category, just like
Mhm.
urban fiction is a, recognized publishing category. I want the same thing for rural because I think that rural kids deserve to be able to go
Yeah.
into a bookstore or the library and be able to go to the rural literature section and find books where they're going to see, mirrors and windows and maybe
Mhm.
windows that are shiny enough to kind of also be mirrors, and see their experiences on the page, which I've told lots of stories about how I messed that up as a rural teacher. And so I'm kind of like doing this work to try to help other people not make those same
Mhm.
mistakes and make up for the ones that I've made in the past. So all of that context to ask this question, which is when you were writing your poetry, did you see your collection as a rural collection? If so, or even if not, like how do you think about the importance of the rural aspect of the collection as like important to it, or like what role does it play in it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And one of the things that I think about, so when I wrote this, it was a very strange moment in my life. I was um, teacher of the year, and there's all this applause, and then there's a lot of ugliness and attacks against me, against my students. It was a very unsafe time. The police actually had to intervene when my students were being attacked. Basically, my high school students who were LGBTQ were being attacked by people in my community. They were sharing pictures of my students at their after school jobs, suggesting that they were somehow nefarious, that they were grooming younger students. And my school would not protect those students. They wouldn't even talk to the students or address it. They were basically just letting these people speak and do what they were doing, and the kids were scared. So I started writing without even realizing I was going to. I was writing an email to my superintendent, an angry one, and then I wrote the first poem. And so I think there was a young person inside of me who really wanted to speak. School was a safe place for him. And school was a safe place for him because of the context of lots of overlapping parts of his identity. School was a safe place for him because he comes from rural Appalachia where being queer wasn't talked about, understood, or seen. And school was a place where he could be understood and seen. He also comes from a rural place where there weren't always adequate resources, and often including food, water, electricity. School had those things. And I think seeing a school that in his mind, in that kid's mind, was charged with protecting students do the exact opposite, forced him to speak. And so when I think about, what place, it is in some ways a love letter to Appalachia. I think this little boy, even though Appalachia didn't really give him much directly in terms of being queer, it gave him so much in terms of resistance and fighting back. It taught him how to believe in himself and assume that the world wouldn't. And for both of those to be true at the same time, it taught him how to laugh in the darkness, to accept the darkness as inevitable. All of those are things that his environment gave him so that he could survive. And then I think, the book was a completion of that. When not speaking is integral to our survival, speaking has to come eventually, right? Or else you don't really fully realize what you are as a person. And even though I've been openly gay for a very long time, I think that kid never got to me. So this was a time for him to reconcile those two parts of his identity and to say, I'm proudly Appalachian and I'm proudly gay. And here's what that looks like when they converge. We often try to separate these two. It's why we need rural queer lit more than ever. I was fortunate to get to work with someone at Shutterstock a year ago. We just happened to be sitting beside of each other at a conference, and she was in charge of representation and imagery. And I said, if you look up queer or gay on Shutterstock, you will see skinny gay men at cafes in cityscapes. Maybe they're at a brunch. But I was like, there's fat gay people living in rural places. Why? I think more needs to be done to let us exist and to stop telling us that we have to sort of map over who we were before. And so, it's very complicated, but I think place is more than just where whatever is happening. Mm-hmm. Place is also, it's tied down and inside of the character. The character can't escape the place, so it's not like a new circumstance changes anything. The new circumstances or a new environment will not erase the context that the character is coming from. I hope that answered the question. I said a lot of things.
Yeah, no. If anyone understands talking through a line of thinking, it is me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of stuff that I think about a lot, especially in terms of I feel like a lot of the work that I do in looking at rural literature, I'm so tempted to always want to talk about the really positive depictions of rural places, because there's just so much negative stuff out there, negative representation of rural. And so I feel like on the one hand, I really want to balance the scales, but at the same time, we can't gloss over the
Mhm.
issues that do exist, um, because they exist
Yeah.
and they need to be addressed and reckoned with. And I think um, Silas House gives a lot of language to those feelings about like how it's possible to love a place even though it doesn't love you back. How it's
Mhm.
possible to love a place even though there are some things that you really hate about it. And how like even though sometimes you want to get out of your place, it's not necessarily always to escape it and to never come back, or
Mhm.
um, for the reasons that people think that it would be. I don't know. I think that rural America especially becomes sort of like the I've said this before, and I hope it's not too like I don't know. I hope it's not too offensive to people, but I just feel like rural America is like the whipping boy of America,
Mhm.
where like we put all of the problems and issues that exist in American society onto these people because they have very little representation.
Mhm.
And that includes like all of the various and multifaceted intersections of rural identity. Um, but we just, rural America is this, rural America is that. And like the things that we say all exist in urban places too,
Mhm.
and all exist in suburban places too. But we don't say that. We don't think about that. We only look at, rural America as all of the bad things
Mhm.
and punish it for those things.
Yeah.
Um
Well, and progressives are, I mean, I am progressive, but
yeah.
progressives are sort of the worst for, I think, wanting to do something with their anger
Mhm.
and taking it out on all of rural America. And, the way I see it, if I'm in a room in Southern California with 10 people, 6 of those people are progressive, 4 are conservative. And if I'm in a room in Kentucky with 10 people, 6 are conservative, 4 are progressive. We're talking about the difference between one person out of 10. And we're allowing that, or people out of 10, and we're allowing that difference to sort of completely cover vast swaths of this country as if we're all sort of ignorant. And, when I wrote this, it's terrifying to write about Appalachia. It's impossible to get right. I remember sitting in an art class once in Morehead State, and we're looking at pictures of like a baby in a diaper in front of a trailer, and there's
Mhm.
like garbage on the ground.
Mhm.
And there's a girl in class who's from the same county I'm from, but she's from Prestonsburg, which has a lot more money
Mhm.
and is much more developed. I'm from the holler. And so she says, this is really offensive because it acts as if this is what Appalachia is when I know that it's not. And then I remember sitting there thinking, is she offended because she's not visible, or if she because this might as well be the thing. It could have been any of my family. So I'm like,
Mhm.
is she offended by our existence,
Mm.
or is she offended that she's not seen? And because there's so little representation, it's almost impossible to tease out what's really happening there. And so, when you write about Appalachia, you're bound to get on some nerves. I did a project with some kids in Appalachia at a specific county in Kentucky, and I just interviewed the kids. I had a preset list of questions, and the kids answered, and they had some beautiful, beautiful things to say about what Appalachia was to them, what it meant to be rural, and they also had some pretty hard truths that they said. And I made a rule because I know how exploitative people can be with the superintendent that I wouldn't publish anything because I was going to publish a column unless she agreed. And the superintendent basically wanted me to go in and replace some of the poorer kids with some richer kids. And I was like, I will not do this. So I know how complicated it is. And someone asked me when you wrote this, like, how afraid were you?
Mm.
And I think I wasn't afraid at all because if you truly love something, it will show. So I truly love Appalachia. I love it dearly, and will protect it with everything I've got. And I think that gives me the right to complain if I need to.
Yeah, I think have you read Sarah Webb Sunderhouse's work on tellable and untellable narratives?
No, but I want to immediately, and I'm writing this down.
Okay. And I think I probably have it in PDF. I cite it heavily in my work because what she does is brilliant. She talks about how there are tellable narratives. So basically like stereotypes, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
there are untellable narratives. And if if you fit into that untellable narrative, like your experience can feel invalidated. And so the where that happens, like where the gaze is and how that happens in terms of like power dynamics is really interesting. But she starts out by telling the story of her Appalachian grandmother, and it's all of the tellable stuff. She didn't graduate from high school, she got married early, she had kids, she was illiterate, like all of these things. And then she like flips it on its head and tells the untellable stuff about how she loved to write recipes and she wrote cookbooks and um, and so like it's like yes and like things are so much more complicated than what
Mm-hmm.
we like to think about, and there's so much more nuance to things. And this is something that I think about a lot because you know I feel deep connections to Appalachia even though I never grew up there, but I don't want to be a JD Vance.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I'm not him because that's not how I think about my relatives from there, and that's
Mm-hmm.
not how I see who I've come from, and it's not in any way how I would want to like depict those folks that that I'm related to, and not I would never, but I'm not technically Appalachian, but I feel, because I am from Appalachians, even
Mm-hmm.
though my grandparents left in the 40s with like
Mm-hmm.
the sort of like great migration to better
Mm-hmm.
work and whatever. I still grew up around folks who identified as hillbilly in a way
Mm-hmm.
that like was sincere to them and that they didn't
Yeah.
see was a bad thing. Um, and so like I sort of consider myself part of like the Appalachian diaspora, like,
Mm-hmm.
second generation once removed. Like I don't know how to term what I am, but I connect so much to the culture because that's the culture that I grew up in. I was closest
Mm-hmm.
to my dad's family, and um so anyway, I think thinking about identity politics and how they connect to place and what that means for
Mm-hmm.
what we see that gets published in literature, what students read in schools, and whether or not they get to see themselves, and like what that means for how we continue to grapple with like place and tradition and culture, and like let's talk about what's bad about our culture and think about like what maybe we might want to do to change that. All of those things I think are super important, and I think that you're doing all of those things in the poetry in your collection, which I think is super important. I really loved your story about the shutter stock uh person talking to them.
Mm-hmm.
I used to do activities like that with my students, like, okay, let's Google like redneck, and like let's just look at all of the different. And so for a lot of the scholarship that I do, I usually include redneck memes and hillbilly memes. And one of my favorites is like, these two fellers sitting with like overalls or exposed bellies, and like with a cooler next to them in front of some dilapidated housing in the background or whatever. And it says, why are or redneck murders are hard to solve because there are no dental records and all of the DNA is the same. Um, and so like that's so offensive. But it's like it I feel like those kind of things that people say about rural people, about, you know, how they understand rural people to be,
Mm-hmm.
are still like widely socially
Oh
acceptable.
yeah. It's
Um,
it is way I say the last frontier and maybe we'll find frontiers, but in otherwise progressive places, it is still absolutely acceptable to pretend as if your Appalachian and maybe all rural people have nothing to offer and are only a joke. And it's perfectly acceptable to mock those conditions that were created in the rooms that are mocking them.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah.
100%. Yes. I totally agree. And that's a large reason why we're here, why we're talking,
Hmm.
because we're trying to change that. So I said in the beginning that I'm really excited to have you here. I mean, for a number of reasons. But one, because you're the first poet that we've ever had, and I've had a lot of like novelists talk about their writing process. But I was wondering if, as a poet, you would talk a little bit about your writing process and what that looks like. And I'm talking everything from like idea germination to like finished product, like and having like a complete poem on the page. Like what is it what does how you
Yeah.
work look like?
For me, it often starts with a feeling. Um, I think it's Toni Morrison talks about these floods that your body. I mean, it's like it's on the skin. Your body remembers something or feels something, and it usually is connected to a memory or some unspoken feeling that you want to give life and agency and voice to. So for me, often it begins with an urge because I'm feeling something, and then when as I write, because I think I tend to write very visual narratives that have characters and place, um, and so it starts with me sitting down and then trying to get that image out in all the ways that I can. And often when I'm trying to describe specifically, like I'm I can't even think of a good example. Um, I think in um, cornmeal and water pancakes, the sort of the
Mm,
swirling of the sugar. I can
mhm.
remember um, closing my eyes and feeling the sugar swirl, having it go through all of my senses. I do a lot of this when I'm writing, like lots of body-based movements because I'm trying to figure out the best way to express um, a concept in a new way so that we can see it better. Because often, if we have an archaic expression or something that words that are usually used together, it's a lot harder to stop and pay attention to what's happening. And so you sort of have to skirt the the hard dance of finding the absolute best word that's going to work, and then making sure that that word works in the context of what you're writing, um, that it has the right connotations, um, that it just works in a sentence sometimes. I tend to I tend to always finish whatever given thing I'm writing about in one sitting,
Mhm.
and there will be lines that itch at me, and then I do a lot of editing and going back to those specific lines until whatever I need figures out how to articulate itself, which sometimes can take days.
Mm. Yeah. I think that's the imagery is one of the things that I appreciate so much about your collection. I mean, in Neck Bones, there are just some really great. I mean, I remember listening to you read it on Read Appalachia and just having goosebumps and being like God, I can feel this, I can taste this, I know it, and so I just thought that that was there's so much that's brilliant about what you do in this collection, but the imagery of the snow in the first poem. I mean, there's just the way your mother smells. um I just it was like walking into my aunt Dida's house,
Mm.
um and so like sorry, go ahead.
Because I think, and I think specifically too, if I'm using memory,
Mm,
so you might have poetry that is inventive or that doesn't even exist in a real place, and so it really has to involve creating a world. And I'm lucky that that little boy who remembered these things, I can put myself at my grandmother's table. I can feel the formica cloth. I can
yeah.
feel the rough side under the tablecloth. I can see the window. It's amazing what he remembers. And when you are writing in when you're inventing a place,
Mhm.
um, it's funny how much is invented that doesn't even make it onto the page. But it has to be fully realized in your head for you to be able to do the work. Um, and so that's sometimes I think that's what we sense when we're reading poetry. Um, that there's something bigger happening than
Mhm.
what we can feel. And that's what always has drawn me to it.
Yeah. And I feel like that comes through really beautifully in the poems. Um, I just there's so much that you write about that I really connect to, and I don't want to bore. I mean, I guess it probably wouldn't be a bore to listeners who have already read the collection, but just in
No,
terms
not
of
at
like
all.
just in terms of like just experience and there was one in particular that I oh yeah, okay, so the cornmeal and water pancakes, you were talking about the sugar swirl.
Hmm.
So um there's a line in there about how like basically the idea that like whatever you need you can figure out because that's what
Hmm.
hillbillies do, right?
Yeah.
And that I just remember my grandma making butter and sugar sandwiches and baking them in the oven when we didn't have nothing else, you
Hmm.
know? And I can smell it. Oops, the book fell. I can smell it, I can taste it. I can see the kitchen and the oven and but my dad always did the same thing too. Like you
Hmm.
just and now I do that. I just go to the pantry and I look at what we
Hmm.
have and it's just like what am I going to make out of what I got because that's all I can do, you know, like
It's
um
it's one of my favorite, if we're allowed to have favorite things about ourselves. Like I don't I am firmly convinced that in an apocalypse, if I were given a tree, I could somehow make biscuits and gravy from the bark. I know that I could, and I have no fear about not having the right tools and equipment and just making what can happen happen. We have a French coffee. It's sort of like a K-pod Keurig,
okay.
but it's a French one.
Okay.
And so it doesn't really work with American counters. So when you try to open it, it wouldn't go under the countertop. But I like looked and finagled and actually whittled the backside of our cabinet away, but you can't tell from the front so that it would open and close. And my friend Courtney, who's also from Floyd County, was like, "That's Floyd County right there." But it's exactly how it works. I love. We had leftovers, um, and I made it was rice. We were at an Airbnb in Chicago,
Mm.
but I woke up and there was rice and like 4 eggs and some French cheese, and someone was like, "What in the world are we gonna do with all this?" And I made like really good pancakes out of them. But yeah, that's the hillbilly.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said something about on the Read Appalachia podcast about how like, you know, we express love through gravy, you know?
Mm,
And like that is so true. And it just took me back to we used to call them big breakfasts on like Saturdays with my grandma. And she made
mhm,
chocolate gravy and she made sausage
mm.
gravy and she made
Where's she from
biscuits.
originally? Do you know?
So um I think she was actually from further to central Tennessee, like Clay County,
Mhm,
um, around Dale Hollow, Salina,
mhm.
Moss. Most people
That
don't know where those things are, but
chocolate gravy are in is in very specific places. So I didn't have it growing up, but a lot of my friends from Godolphin County had it. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but
yeah, no, it's fine.
chocolate gravy gets me excited.
Yeah, but my dad's dad and all of that side of the family was from East Tennessee.
Mhm.
I think my grandpa was actually born in Sevier County, or but my great grandpa was originally from Guyana, West Virginia, so they just kind of migrated, like further west, further west.
Mhm.
So anyway, but yeah, so then now I make sausage gravy, and I'm very particular about my biscuits. I've got my recipe, I've got it memorized, and I like it a little on the sweet side because
Mhm.
then you can also use it as like a makeshift shortcake if you're like, if you're in a pinch. um,
Yes.
but but yeah, like I think that that's like the collection encompasses so much of all of the different facets of culture, food and language and place and experience and interactions between people, that all really make up what place is and what it looks like and feels like, whether you're there or not anymore. And
Mhm.
I think that that's the power of literature, right? Is that I so deeply related to and connected to the things that you wrote about. Um, I was just reading your poem Embarrassing, and like the 90s style of baggy t-shirts, and I used to wear my dad is 6'3", and he's bigger than he used to be, but even at that time he was probably around 300 pounds. And I
Hmm.
used to, as a sixth grader, I used to wear his old t-shirts.
There was no limit back then.
No, and it was the most comfortable and confident I had ever felt, as a fat kid, who was routinely, picked on. And
Hmm.
so, like, there is so much about everything that you wrote about that I connected so deeply to, and that is the power of literature, and that is why it is so important for there to be more rural books in the world that really capture all of the different and various intersections of identities that exist in those spaces. So I'm just really grateful to you that that you wrote this, and that fears, you conquered all of the anxieties that come along with putting yourself out there in the world, and along with writing about Appalachia,
Thank you.
because we need books like this.
And I'm grateful to that kid for knowing what to feel, remembering what was important to him. Um, and I think because there's so many of those things we don't talk about, language in particular, like, every single generation that wants to ask the question, why aren't more Appalachians in college? They all have some different reason. So now it's evidently drug use. And I'm not underplaying drug use because it is a major problem, but it's not like it's not a major problem everywhere, yet we still see lower rates of college and post-secondary education in Appalachia, right? So it can't just be the drug use. And there wasn't drug use a generation and a half ago, but those numbers were still lower. When I think back, my first week of college at Morehead State, so 156 first cousins. I was the first. No one had ever tried it or done it. And I didn't know how I didn't know how to get a refund check. But I knew enough to, like, add up all my scholarships and loans and look at the cost of tuition, and I was like, I think I'm supposed to get money back. So I went to the office and talked to whoever was there, and Morehead, Kentucky might as well have been Jupiter for me because it was, even if it was in Eastern Kentucky, it is, like, on the edge of it, and the people who work there aren't.
Right.
So I go to
Hmm.
the financial aid and I say, "Hey, I think I'm supposed to get money back." And I sort of explain. And so this woman who's working there says to me in a very standard accent, "Okay, what I hear you saying is," and then she says something else. I legitimately ran out of the room while she was talking and cried because
Mm.
all I heard was, "You're a dumb hillbilly." And let me say it
Mhm.
in a better way.
Yeah.
The hangups and the anxieties that people feel. Like, I have standard kids, in Lexington, Kentucky, going to school here who routinely, have to drop a class because they're too panicked to talk in front of people or because there's
Mhm.
too much performance involved. Like, when we think about how much harder that is for a kid who's been told their entire lives that people are gonna make fun of them or who experiences people actually making fun of them, and we really don't do anything about it socially.
Yeah. And I mean, my mom even went to college and got a nursing degree, but I mean, when I moved to Purdue, I lived in a building that housed the same number of people that lived in my town, and it's just like, how am I
Mhm,
supposed to exist here? And I remember calling my mom, who I was the oldest of five kids, and so she was still very busy, and too busy to help me because the narrative was always like, Shay'll figure it out on her own. Shay'll figure it out on her own, and that's pretty much my whole life. Um, but I remember calling her and being like, "Mom, I keep getting this orange notice in my mailbox, and it tells me that I have to go to the registrar's office. And what is a registrar?" And she's like,
mm,
"Shay, it's a building on campus. Just find it on the map and go and ask what you need to do." And I was just like, I don't, what?
yeah,
And so then that's what I did, right? Because like,
mhm,
what else is there to do?
mhm,
And I just had learned kind of to bottle it up and smile, and try to change the way I pronounce certain things,
mhm,
and to talk in that standard accent as much as I could, and just to be sugary sweet, and as a woman like acting dumb, then people kind
mhm,
of like want to help you,
yeah,
which I think is different in terms of like, gender performance and assumptions about
Hmm.
people of different genders. But I went and I was just like, I keep getting these orange things in my mailboxes and I don't, what does it want from me? I don't understand what I'm supposed to do. And then it's kind of like oh, here, honey, let me help
Hmm.
you. It sort of
Yeah.
becomes one of those things. And so like, that's how I navigated in the university, because I had like, I'm the first person in my dad's family to graduate. My
Hmm.
dad went and completed some credits, but he never finished. And I totally understand why
Yeah.
after going, you know?
When I came out, uh, my dad's first sentence was something like, "Well, I wish you weren't." And I
Mhm.
said, "Well, you and me both, but and we ain't gonna change that." And then we both laughed. And he goes, "Well, I didn't mean that hatefully." And I go, "I know." And then he said, "Well, you're soft spoken and easily hurt." And he was like, "You got to walk into every room the rest of your life, like you're better than everybody else in there. And if you try that, maybe you'll get close to thinking you're good enough." Um, so I took that to heart, and it helped me in so many more ways. Um, to It's not even faking it till you make it, and it wasn't like I was believing that I was better than anybody else, but it took a lot of work, to get where I needed to go.
Yeah, and I think that people underestimate just how hard it is.
Mhm,
And I wrote an academic book called Country Teachers in City Schools, and it's all about that. Like, um, you know, just the complete underestimation of how hard it is for rural people to exist in non-rural spaces
mhm,
and be able to figure out how to interact with people in ways where they don't think you're stupid.
mhm.
And that that if like there's no like rural cultural center on most
Yeah,
campuses, and even if there is a rural center for
mhm,
education, it's about preparing teachers to teach in rural places, not
yeah,
a place for rural people to come together and just like be with one another,
mhm.
and not have to explain themselves or not have to apologize
Oh,
when they say something that they think sounds country or whatever.
I was at the Appalachian Writers Workshop in, Hazard, and no, Harlan.
Harlan.
And I didn't realize how, like, tense we stay in life until I realized just how relaxed I was that everyone there talked like me, uh,
Hmm.
because it matters. It matters a great deal.
It really does. And so I'm hoping to help like teachers in secondary spaces understand that, because again, like there's not a lot of us who make it into universities and then become teachers and sort of have that. And even if we do, like, I was a rural teacher in a rural space and I still held this idea about like what a good book is,
Mhm.
and what students should appreciate and should be reading, and I was totally wrong about it.
Yeah,
And so like now I'm trying to fix that.
yeah. I read Georgia Lyon as
Mm,
a With a Hammer to My Heart.
mhm.
I don't know if you've read it. It is one of the most beautiful and poignant pieces of literature that I've ever read, and I'm angry that I was never asked to read it.
Yeah.
It was written in the '90s. Why at no point when someone was 2 counties over, wrote this was I never asked to read it, and why has it received no major awards?
Mhm.
We all know why, right? And I can't even be mad at the individuals responsible for me not reading it, because I never asked anyone to read it, right? I
Right.
talked for years, and we read lots of other people.
Yes. Yeah, I know. The same here. And a lot of that was just going into the book room and seeing what we have, but there are
Mhm.
reasons why what we
Yeah,
had was what we had. And I mean,
yeah.
I taught As I Lay Dying, which I think was as close as I got really to teaching a rural book, but it was, history,
Mhm,
is, not a contemporary rural experience. And it was a mock epic that poked fun at rural people, you know?
mhm,
Um, so yeah, I felt the same way when I read Melissa Wyatt's Funny How Things Change. It was
mhm,
published in 2009, and like that's right in the, time window where I was teaching. And I was like, how did I not know that this book exists? How did I not know that it existed? I had readers who wanted to reread Where the Red Fern Grows because it was a mirror for them. And
Hmm.
like those readers who loved that book definitely would have loved this book. Like I
Hmm.
wish I would have been able to recommend it to them, but I had no idea it existed.
Yeah.
Um,
And mirrors open windows. We forget that.
yeah.
Being able to see yourself makes you want to see other people.
Right, right. If all you ever do is read about the experiences of other people, of course you're going to be resentful about the rest of the
Mhm.
world. Like
Yeah.
if you never get to see yourself represented authentically and your experience is honored and recognized and not, positioned as like the butt of some redneck joke, of course
Mhm.
you're going to be angry and not want to
Yeah.
read.
The research shows that in a classroom, if you don't have someone speak within the first 5 minutes, you've lost them the rest of the lesson. And I think the same is true for lit. If they don't get to hear themselves speak in what they read, you've probably lost them.
Yeah.
Um,
So the last question that I have that I ask everybody is, what advice do you have for, especially like thinking about rural Appalachian, kids, students, young people, who want to be writers or maybe feel like they don't have a story to tell. What advice do you have for them?
one of the things that I truly, truly believe is that stories heal. And I think, what I've done is a bit direct in terms of that. Our stories heal ourselves. I think by and large, we have in the stories of our lives what we need to heal ourselves entirely. But I think we can also heal other people with our stories. And so healing other people can mean a lot of different things. It could mean an individual's relationship to themselves, an individual's relationship to the world around them. It can also mean all of our relationships to concepts or to the world. So I would say to anybody, you know, what healing do you see that needs to take place, and how can you participate in that conversation? Um, Obviously, you might just be wanting to write for fun, but fun is healing, right? Laughter is healing. Excitement can be healing. So I would ask, especially at this moment in time, where does that healing naturally want to come from for you, and how can you contribute to that? And I would also say, especially to Appalachian readers and really to any reader, if your way of talking or experiencing the world isn't the same as what's expected of you in school, then don't feel like you need to start with what everyone else is doing. Obviously, there's lots to learn from the world around us, but the world around us has a particular lens. What's been written has a particular lens, and what hasn't been written and what hasn't been lensified often has value too. And you probably know a lot that you can share with the world. So value what other writers have done before you for sure, but don't forget to value what you would want to do that you don't see them doing. And don't assume that just because other people aren't doing it, it's wrong.
Hmm.
There's lots of ways to tell stories.
My granny is my granny used to say there's more than one way to skin a cat.
Yep. There's definitely a lot of ways to skin cats.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, thank you so much, Willie, for being here, for chatting with me. I appreciate you taking the time and just one more time, I want to say thank you so much for your collection. It's beautiful and brilliant, and I've loved every word.
Shay, thank you so much. Thank you for all of your help and investment and just kindness in telling me, and not just my story, but all of these stories. And it matters so much what you're doing. And can't wait to see what the world's like in 20 years because of it.
Oh, thank
But we won't
you.
wait 20 years. We'll talk sooner than that.
Okay. Yes, I hope so because I really want to be real friends.
I'll message you my phone number.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
If you liked what you heard in this author talk with Willie Edward Taylor Carver Jr., and you would like to make sure you never miss another episode, please make sure that you subscribe to the YouTube channel if you like to watch facial expressions when people are talking like I do. Or you can also subscribe to our podcast via your favorite podcatcher of choice. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, any of those major places. And if you want to help other people find us, you could tell your friends about us, or you could rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts or any of those other platforms. It really does help the algorithm help other people find us, and that helps rural readers get books that reflect their experiences in their hands. And who doesn't want that? So if you could do that, I'd be mighty obliged. Other ways that you can support the show are to visit our TeePublic storefront and buy some of our merch. The designs that are listed there, you can get on pretty much anything. Stickers, coffee mugs, tote bags, pillowcases, baby onesies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, you name it. You can get those designs on there and represent your rural set. So that would be amazing if you would so choose to do that. Other ways to support us would be buying books that we recommend from our bookshop.org bookshelf. Bookshop.org does a lot for indie presses and indie sellers, and so we like to support them, and if you could support us while supporting them, it's a win-win-win all around. So any of those things would be amazing. I appreciate you doing what you can, and stay tuned for our next episode coming up next month. It's the beginning of spooky season, and we will have some spooky literature for y'all. So stay tuned then. Y'all come back now, would ya?